Paganism is a topic that I think attracts quite a lot of general interest. But there's still quite a lot of confusion as to what exactly paganism is. Who are pagans? Part of the confusion derives from the fact that paganism is not like Christianity, it's not like Islam, it's not like Buddhism. It doesn't represent a singular movement with a distinct identifiable history and core underlying beliefs. It is instead a word that has come to mean different things in different contexts, and to understand what someone means when they're talking about pagans or paganism, you have to understand which particular meaning they are using. Now there are two general broad meanings of the word paganism and pagan as they currently now exist. The first is the older and much broader term, and it's a term that is fundamentally rooted in Christian theological thought, even if it's being used by people who aren't themselves Christians. Christianity, of course, arises in the province of Judea, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire during the 1st century. It splinters from the Jewish religion, and like the Jewish religion, is monotheistic, believing in one single God. Now, the majority of other religious practices and beliefs that existed, both across the Roman Empire and beyond it at this time, were not monotheistic. They were polytheistic. They believed in a wide range of different deities, both male gods and female goddesses. Now, from the Christian perspective, this was idolatry, and they understood these different non-Christian deities as usually being demons in disguise. And from the Christian perspective, they adopted a word to describe all of these people. They called them the pagans. So in the Christian perspective, people who worshipped the God of Abraham, meaning either Jews or Christians, formed one group, and everyone outside of that group was to be called a pagan. This meant that the vast majority of people across the world were pagans. Pagans were those who failed to worship the God of Abraham. And of course, as time goes on, the term has come to be contested even more. In the 7th century, Islam appears on the scene. And of course, Muslims identify their deity, under the Arabic name Allah, as also part of this monotheistic Abrahamic tradition. But Christians have always been a bit hesitant. Are they pagans or aren't they? And you'll find different answers in different places. Even amid the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, many Protestants declared that the Roman Catholic Church, despite its professed monotheism, was in reality pagan. Because look at all the finery of their churches, look at their lavish rituals, look at their veneration of the saints. So if you look at Protestant literature from the Reformation period, you will regularly see Roman Catholics being accused of paganism and being called pagan. The word pagan and paganism were fundamentally fluid. They could mean slightly different things in different contexts. And of course, even when you get free thinkers, atheists, and irreligious people who come onto the scene later, they too sometimes get accused of being pagans. And indeed, you still do find people who are atheists or secular humanists or people in that sort of neck of the woods who refer to themselves as pagans, often in a sort of semi-humorous manner. And of course, even many non-Christians have inherited this sort of use of language. When we talk about the pre-Christian religion of many peoples in ancient Rome or the ancient Scandinavians or whatever it may be, one still finds many archaeologists and historians referring to them as pagan. So this terminology from a Christian theological context continues to be used even outside that theological context. So that's definition 1. Pagans being those who do not worship the God of Abraham. Definition 2 encompasses modern paganism, sometimes called Neo-Paganism. This describes a family of related new religious movements whose practitioners openly identify, most of the time, not always, as pagans. Some will even adopt the banner of pagan pride to reclaim this word that has had negative connotations for many centuries. They are reclaiming it as a source of definition, as self-definition. And often in contemporary scholarly contexts, we try to differentiate these two meanings by using the lowercase p for paganism and pagan when referring to the Christian context, and the uppercase P for pagan when talking about modern paganism, just as a way of, on the page, making it clear what we're actually talking about. So where does this word come from? As I mentioned, Christianity arises in the Roman Empire. And while there were many different languages spoken in the empire, the dominant one, the language of Rome itself, was Latin. And the word pagan ultimately comes from the Latin language. Now, pagan derives from a word called pagus. Now, in Latin, a pagus was a kind of rural district. It was a way of demarcating an area of land, an administrative term. And the people who lived in the pagus were, in plural, the pagani. How this term, meaning essentially sort of rural folk, or country bumpkin, or yokel, if you will, came to mean someone who did not worship the God of Abraham, is still a bit of a mystery. And in truth, it probably always will be, because there simply isn't historical evidence to determine why the meaning changed. But classicists and historians have made various suggestions, so we have various possible ideas. One of the ideas, associated, for example, with the French Hellenist Pierre Chivin, is that it was actually certain people living in these rural areas who adopted the term for themselves. They described themselves as pagani, people of the place, people who worshipped the gods of that place, in contrast to what they called the alieni, the people from elsewhere, the people who worshipped the god from Judea. One possibility. A second possibility arises from a different meaning of the word paganus. Now, by the 2nd or 3rd century, we have evidence that the word paganus was being used in Latin contexts to refer to a civilian. Now, this probably arises from the Roman military. Obviously, Roman soldiers weren't always based in Rome itself. They were often set away out in the provinces where they were living alongside rural communities. These soldiers may have then understood themselves as, well, we are the army, they are the civilians, they are the pagani. Christians come along, and the Christians understand themselves as miles Christi. They understand themselves as soldiers of Christ. So it is possible that these soldiers of Christ referred to those who had not yet enrolled in Jesus' army as the pagans. That's a second possible option for how the term changed its meaning. We actually only have inscriptions and references to the word, words pagan being used in this religious context from the late 4th century. By the 4th century, of course, Christianity is becoming a big player in the Roman Empire, thanks to the likes of Constantine and Theodosius. And at this time, various Christian writers are beginning to speculate how their predecessors in the Christian community picked up the term pagan. They don't seem to know themselves, but they're speculating. And they're suggesting that it was because pagans, people in the rural areas, sort of lagged behind in embracing Christianity. Their idea was that Christianity really took on in urban areas, and thus urban people could be seen as Christians, rural people, pagani, continued to venerate non-Christian deities. So these are sort of some of the etymological context of this particular term and how it came to be embraced in Christian theological thought. But of course in the English language we also have another synonym, the word heathen. Now, English is a Germanic language. It's a member of the Germanic language family, and we find a similar term in other Germanic languages. Forgive my pronunciation, but the likes of heathen in Icelandic or heidenen in Dutch. All of these arise from an East Germanic language that's now extinct, a language called Gothno. Now, our earliest appearance in the textual record of this term heideno, and probably its actual origin itself, comes from a Gothic translation of the Gospel of Mark, produced by a Christian missionary called Ulfilas. Now, Ulfilas is translating things into Gothic. He's trying to help the Goths to understand. So it seems he has translated the reference to Hellenes, Greeks, but in this context Greek also had connotations of non-Christian at this particular time, he translates it into heathno. Heathno in turn spreads through and becomes similar terms in the other Germanic languages, including our modern English term heathen. And of course, in other languages you have other terms that are somewhat synonymous. In the East Slavic languages, like Serbo-Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian, the word yazychnik has similar connotations to pagan or heathen. Of course, Christianity is a missionizing religion. Christians usually seek to promote their religion and gain new followers. They seek to convert those they regard as pagans. And over the centuries, Christianity has spread into various new regions of the world. In the Roman Catholic form, of course, it was spread heavily by the Spanish and Portuguese in what is now Latin America. Protestant variants were spread to the Sami in northern Europe by Scandinavians and to much of North America by the British. And of course, Eastern Orthodoxy was spread into much of northern Asia, what we now call Siberia, by the Russians. And attempts were made to convert many of the other world populations to Christianity, with varying degrees of success. Obviously, we look at some countries well outside the European sphere of influence, and today we find Christianity as the largest religion. In South Korea, for example, Christianity is now the single largest religious tradition. In other areas, like Nigeria, Christianity and Islam have become dominant, but other pre-Christian religious traditions continue to survive in a lesser form. Then there are other parts of the world where what one might call indigenous non-Christian traditions still remain dominant. This is the case, for example, in Japan, where Shinto remains, alongside Buddhism, one of the main two traditions. Similarly, in India, Hinduism remains the religion of the bulk of the population. So we can see how this term, pagan, had a sort of colonial context in the way it was spread, in the way that it was used by primarily European Christians as they sought to spread their influence across the world. At the same time, there was a counter-tendency, a tendency to look upon the pagan as almost something good, something interesting. And the origins of this, in a big way, in Europe, lie in 14th century Italy. Here you have the emergence of Renaissance humanism, of artists, of writers who begin looking to the classical world of Greece and Rome and saying, this isn't just primitive barbarism. There is beauty here. There are things of interest. You begin to see the ancient Greco-Roman works of writers like Homer and Virgil and Ovid coming to be reread and spread more widely. You're beginning to see depictions of pre-Christian deities appearing on art of many different kinds. Think of, for example, Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, a classic example. This doesn't mean people were actively venerating these pre-Christian deities, although if they were probably doing it in secret and would have left very little evidence for us to determine if this was the case. But nevertheless, there is a cultural reassessment of the pre-Christian past, an increasing approach that looks upon it as something good, not as something barbaric and awful. And while this begins in Italy in the 14th century, these attitudes begin to spread to other parts of Europe. It becomes essential, if you are an upper-class educated European male, to have a thorough understanding of classical literature by the 18th and 19th centuries. Young men go on the grand tour to look at the classical architecture of Rome and Greece. Neoclassical architecture comes into form. Go to the British Museum today, it's based on a neoclassical model. At the same time, as we sort of come towards the 17th, 18th centuries, we also begin to see the positive reassessment of other pre-Christian religious traditions elsewhere in Europe. In the 17th century, medieval Icelandic literature, which talks about gods like Odin and Thor, begins to get translated out of Old Norse, out of medieval Icelandic languages, and disseminated across Europe more widely. And you begin to then see by the 18th century portrayals of Norse deities in the artwork, in the paintings, in the sculpture, albeit anachronistically often dressed up as classical figures. There's a syncretism going on there. And of course, by the early 19th century, you have the emergence of Romanticism, and groups all over Europe beginning to search for what are often considered to be their national origins. This is often bound up closely with cultural nationalism and with the emergence of folklore studies as a discipline, as scholars begin to look at the recorded folklore from recent centuries in the hope that they can find evidence of their national pre-Christian religions. And you begin to see books published, for example, the Welsh Mabinogion comes out in an accessible form in the 19th century, the Finnish Kalevala appears around the same time, and these feed into, for example, contemporary fantasy fiction. The influence of this material on Tolkien is especially evident. The other cultural event that it of course feeds into is the emergence of modern paganism, is the emergence of Neo-paganism into the early 20th century. Now, modern paganism is not a single religion in and of itself. It's not like Christianity, it's not like Islam in that respect. It is instead a family of related religious traditions that share a great interest in the pre-Christian traditions of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia, the areas where the pre-Christian traditions were ultimately rendered extinct by the emergence and spread of Christianity and Islam. These different modern pagan religions nevertheless sometimes cooperate, sometimes collaborate for their shared interests. The Pagan Federation, formerly known as the Pagan Front, for example, formed in this country in the 1970s, while in Vilnius in the 1990s we see the emergence of the European Congress of Ethnic Religions, again bringing together certain modern pagan traditions to discuss their shared interests, to work towards their shared promotion. Modern paganism really arises out of the broader esoteric milieu that we find in Europe and in North America during the sort of late 19th century. You have movements like Theosophy, like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which we wouldn't necessarily say are modern pagan traditions, but they are looking to things which are not Christian and positively reassessing them. They're looking, for example, to the religions of India and of China and of Japan, and they're also looking to Europe's pre-Christian past. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, for instance, publishes a book called Isis Unveiled in 1877. She is drawing upon Isis, a deity who originates in ancient Egypt, and putting her centre stage in a rhetorical context in the late 19th century. You then begin to get groups emerging, particularly in the early 20th century, who in many ways revived the worship of specific pre-Christian deities. An early example was Thelema, the religion established by Aleister Crowley in 1904. He's in Cairo at the time, and his religion comes to be influenced highly by ancient Egyptian iconography. You subsequently have, in Germanophone Europe, a chap called Franz Sadler establishing the Adonistic Society in 1925. He forms his own theology centering on 5 particular deities, but these themselves are drawn from pre-Christian traditions. Over in the United States, in New York in 1939, the Russian emigre Gleb Botkin forms the Church of Aphrodite. He takes this Greek goddess and treats her as a sort of monotheistic deity. In his words, she is the creator and mother of the cosmos. You can see with these 3 examples, the Church of Aphrodite, the Adonistic Society, and Thelema, they're not trying to accurately recreate specific pre-Christian tradition, but they are nevertheless very interested in the pre-Christian past, and they're very interested in drawing from it into the future. Really, today, what is today the largest of the modern pagan traditions, and which helps to really get the ball rolling when it comes to the publicisation of modern paganism, is Wicca. Wicca comes to public attention in England in the 1950s, when it's spearheaded by a chap called Gerald Gardner. Gardner and his other early followers believe that the witches persecuted in early modern Europe during the witch trials were themselves practitioners of a pre-Christian religion devoted to a horned god. This is no longer an idea accepted by historians, but at the time there were quite a few writers who not only accepted the idea but promoted it quite widely. So although Gardner's ideas may seem somewhat outlandish in a historical context today, they would not have seemed so during the 1950s. By the 1960s, his tradition, Wicca, had spread to the United States and also to Australia and other countries, where people took it and began working it into their own particular traditions. You have some that came to, for instance, have an ethnic focus, like the Italian variant Stregeria, or the Welsh variant, the traditionalist Gwyddoniad, forgive my pronunciation. You also have the influence of second-wave feminism beginning to be felt on the Wiccan movement, especially with the formation of the Dianic Wiccan tradition, which centered specifically on a goddess in California in the early 1970s. And then, out of the Dianic tradition, you have Starhawk, who establishes the reclaiming tradition and publishes a book called The Spiral Dance in 1979, which becomes a major international influence. Since the 1970s, you also see Wiccans increasingly embrace the idea that theirs is a nature religion or nature spirituality, and that in turn comes to impact the rhetoric of not just Wicca itself, but other modern pagan traditions too, which will often present themselves as nature religion. The 1970s also began to see the increasing publication of books outlining how the reader can become a pagan or can become a Wiccan themselves. In this context, one no longer has to find an existing Wiccan group, which is called a coven. One can set oneself up as a practitioner on the general Wicca model themselves. This has significant repercussions, for demographic data now shows that a very clear majority of people practicing Wicca are solitary practitioners. Now, I mentioned that Wiccan groups are called covens. This is in large part because Wicca has absorbed the rhetoric and imagery associated with European witchcraft and has made that fundamental to its essential structure. Wicca typically revolves around the veneration of both a goddess and a horned god, and the practice of rites which are explicitly referred to as magical and are conducted within the context of a magic circle. This, of course, reflects the influence of earlier ceremonial magic traditions that Gardner and other early Wiccans were familiar with. The second major modern pagan tradition is modern pagan Druidry. Now, the original Druids were effectively sort of ritual specialists, religious specialists, who existed in certain West European societies that spoke Celtic languages. In truth, we do not know a lot about them, because all of the information written about them is written by either later Christian sources, for example in Ireland, or it is written by contemporary classical sources, Greek and Roman writers, who themselves had a sort of othering view of these peoples that existed over in Western Europe. But the imagery of the Druids, even if we don't know much about them for sure, has fascinated people for centuries. Indeed, in the 18th century, with renewed antiquarian interest in these ancient Druids, you begin to get groups emerge based on the Masonic model. So these are fraternal groups whose practitioners openly refer to themselves as Druids. In Wales, in particular, you begin to see sort of cultural nationalists take an interest in the Druid in particular. People like Iolo Morganwg and William Price, who begin to refer to themselves as Druids. So by the early 20th century, we have many people going around who call themselves Druids. Some members of particular fraternal groups, quasi-Masonic groups, others for kind of cultural reasons often linked to growing ideas of national Celticity or Celtic identity. But in the early 20th century, you also begin to get people interested in the Druidic identity as a modern religious identity. One of the earliest groups was the Church of the Universal Bond, founded by the Scotsman George MacGregor Reid in This was followed by the foundation of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids by Ross Nichols in 1964. Meanwhile, over in the United States, the Reformed Druids of North America form at Carleton College in Minnesota in 1963. So certainly the 1960s, the time that Wicca is beginning to become more and more widely seen in Britain and North America, you're having increasing numbers of people identify as a Druid as well. Now, these early sort of forms of Druidry, religious Druidry, are often influenced by things like Theosophy. They are not always explicitly modern pagan in the way they approach things. As time goes on, by the 1990s, the modern pagan identity becomes increasingly central to the modern Druidic identity. But modern Druidry is nevertheless quite diverse. Practitioners of Druidry can be polytheists, they can be monotheists, and they can practice other religions as well as Druidry. Indeed, there's been some recently survey data done that's shown not only that there are quite a few Christians who identify as Druids, but there is at least one Muslim who identifies as a Druid as well. At the same time, Druids often emphasise the Celtic cultural identity. They often venerate pre-Christian deities from linguistically Celtic contexts, as well as also venerating what they refer to as the spirits of the place and the spirits of the ancestors. Their groups are often called groves, or the larger groups are often called orders instead. Like Wiccans, they often identify Druidry as a nature religion or nature spirituality, and this is reinforced by the celebration of nature-based festivals. Whereas Wicca centres on the practice of magic, modern Druidry often instead emphasises artistic pursuits or poetry, and there's often a rhetorical focus on the Welsh word arwen, meaning divine inspiration. Of course, in the cultural imagination, Druids are associated with stone circles, and most of all with Stonehenge. Although these sort of stone circles actually, we now know, date from the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, centuries before the Iron Age Druids ever existed, the linkage between Druids and stone circles was really cemented in the sort of 17th and 18th century by antiquarians like John Aubrey and William Stukeley, and it has then been inherited in the culture. For example, in a lot of folk language, vernacular language in many parts of Britain, stone circles became known as Druid circles, evidence for the antiquarian interest filtering into popular language. And similarly, modern Druids have then picked up this interest in stone circles and often perform their rituals in these locations. A famous example is the Druid who refers to himself as King Arthur Pendragon, and who has campaigned for many years on issues surrounding access to Stonehenge. So, stone circles remain very important spiritual places for modern Druids. A third form of modern paganism that can be found today is heathenry. Heathenry is a general term for religions that focus on the pre-Christian deities of linguistically Germanic societies. So the pre-Christian English or Anglo-Saxons, the Norse or the Vikings, also people in parts of the Low Countries and Germany. Heathenry is probably the most widely known term for this religious tradition, but other variants include Fornsida, which means sort of the old way, or Asatru, or Wodenism, Odinism, or the northern tradition. Modern heathenry emerges in the early 20th century in Germanophone parts of Europe, Germany and Austria. And at the time it is quite heavily interwoven with ultra-nationalist ideology, we might call like folkish ideology. Examples include the Wotanist movement of Guido von List and Jacob Wilhelm Hauer's German faith movement, which was established in 1933. Overlap between these groups and what subsequently emerged as the Nazi movement, although the influence that modern paganism and occultism actually had on Nazism has been much exaggerated by later popular fiction. There was a revival of interest in heathenry during the 1960s and 1970s, around the same time, of course, that Wicca and Druidry were beginning to gain traction. new heathen groups emerge in Iceland, in Germany, in Britain and in the United States, and again generally following this sort of ethnic nationalist understanding and approach to the religion. Things begin to shift as we move into the late 1980s and 1990s, as increasing numbers of heathen adopt what in the community have come to be called universalist attitudes. The idea that worshipping the heathen gods, the old gods of linguistically Germanic societies, need not be linked intrinsically to, for want of a better word, a Germanic racial identity. And you get groups like the Ring of Troth, which formed in the 1980s, which espouse this particular approach. Now, heathenry is typically polytheistic, venerating the pre-Christian deities of Germanic societies. Also adopting often cosmological ideas, such as the idea of the world tree, Yggdrasil, from Old Norse material. Heathen groups are often called kindreds or hearths, although there are many practitioners who also follow the tradition solitarily. Sacrificial rites, sacrificial in the sense of offering drink and food to the deities, is often called blot, although some heathens also engage in what they call seither, which is a term borrowed from medieval sources, where it referred to a sort of oracular tradition of vision-seeking. And in the modern heathen context, it's often been quite heavily influenced by the sort of neo-shamanic traditions associated with writers like Michael Harner. Moral attitudes or ethical attitudes in the heathen community often again derive from the influence of medieval sources, particularly Old Norse medieval sources, emphasizing things like honor, integrity, and family loyalty. Bearing quite a few similarities to heathenry, but shifting focus from the Germanic world over to the Slavic one, is a religion that in Slavic languages is often referred to as native faith. In Russian, for example, this becomes Rodnovery. Now, these arise similarly from cultural nationalistic ideas that are brewing within the context of the early 20th century and are influenced by counterparts taking place in particularly Germany and Austria. In the 1930s, Poland, for example, people involved in Jan Stachniak's Zadruga movement begin to show an interest in pre-Christian tradition and how that could potentially be revived in the modern day. But then, of course, the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninist governments take power in most of that region in the wake of the Second World War, and often take a very dim view of modern paganism. And thus, some of the peoples in Slavic countries who want to continue following this spiritual path end up leaving and moving abroad. An example is the Ukrainian Lev Silenko, who fled from Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, to Canada, where he established the native Ukrainian national faith movement, or Revere, in 1966, many of its practitioners being members of the Ukrainian diaspora in that country. Of course, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses, and new religious freedoms become available to people in most linguistically Slavic countries. And it is then that we begin to see the revival of Rodnova groups, often of course spread with the internet, which has been a boon to most modern pagan traditions. In contrast to what we see in Western countries, Rodnova groups are primarily group-centered. They still have a predominance of people who are group members rather than solitary practitioners. And they also tend to be more socially conservative than most Western pagans, and also more prone to ethnic nationalist ideas, reflecting the general socio-political movements and milieus that are common in Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, we see a lot of parallels with Rodnova groups and Western pagan communities. For example, in the ideas of the theological eclecticism that we see. For example, a group like Lev Silenko's Revere, that I mentioned, is actually monotheistic. It believes that the solar deity Dajbog is the one god. Conversely, there are plenty of other Rodnova groups who are polytheistic, venerating not only the likes of Dajbog, but also the likes of Perun or Svarog. very different from Rodnovery, certainly in its socio-political context and ideology, is the goddess movement, otherwise often referred to as goddess spirituality or goddess feminism. As its name suggests, this is a tradition primarily followed by women, although there are men involved as well, and it comes out of the second wave feminist movement, primarily of 1970s America. We've seen the influence of second wave feminism on Wicca in the form of Dianic Wicca, and this in turn feeds into the broader goddess movement, as do writings like the work of Carol P. Christ. In turn, although it initially starts in the United States, it soon spreads to other countries, as to this one. We, for example, now have the Goddess Temple in Glastonbury, that some people here may be familiar with. Central to the goddess movement, again, as its name suggests, is goddess imagery. But there is nevertheless, again, theological eclecticism going on. Some goddess worshippers will treat the goddess in a monotheistic way, as if there is one great Earth Mother goddess. Others will talk polytheistically, about many different goddesses from different world traditions. And some will talk both, sometimes in a monotheistic way, sometimes in a polytheistic way. The eclectic attitude that's quite common among the goddess movement is also similar to the New Age movement, that is often conflated with modern paganism, but is a separate phenomena, albeit one that is in many ways contemporary to it. Ritual practices in the goddess movement are often focused on celebrating and marking elements or periods in the female life cycle, or assisting women to heal from the likes of domestic or sexual abuse. A recurring idea within goddess feminism or the goddess movement is what scholar of religion Cynthia Eller referred to as the myth of matriarchal prehistory. This is the idea that human societies used to be goddess-centered, had a system of gender equity, and were peaceful and living in harmony with the earth, until around 3000 BC or BCE, these goddess-centered civilizations were overthrown and a patriarchy established. This is actually not an idea novel to the goddess movement. It originates in its sort of fundamentals from the 1860s and a Swiss scholar called Johann Jakob Bachofen in his book Mother Right. It became widespread in late 19th century intellectual circles. You can see the influence, for example, in the work of Friedrich Engels and Matilda Joslyn Gage, but declined as an interpretive framework among historians and anthropologists into the early 20th century, before being revived in feminist context by the works of writers like Merlin Stone and Maria Gimbutas in the 1970s, at the time that the goddess movement was forming. I hope I've been able to give you a bit of an insight today, as brief as it has been, into the conceptual history of paganism. Also into the beliefs and practices of the main or most common modern pagan traditions, and a little insight, although I didn't get to focus too much, on the sort of visual cultures of the past that influence modern pagan spirituality. So, thank you.
What would you say is the most, what's your most favourite ritual that you've
You have to perform now.
Yeah. I don't have an answer. It's not that I'm not answering, I don't have an answer. Various things, interest me at different times. I can't honestly say one thing has particular interest above others, or a ritual that particularly interests me.
Yeah.
I'm personally very interested in what we call the materiality of religion. I'm really pretty interested in things like shrine structures and the idea, I didn't get to talk about it here, I talk about it a bit in my book, in the idea of divinity being present in material form. For example, in Hinduism we have this idea of the murti, the sort of statue of deity, that the deity literally inhabits. And we see other similar ideas in other religious traditions in other parts of the world. That really interests me on a personal, sort of academic level. So that's the stuff I'm perhaps most interested in at the moment. but that will change. New things take my fancy. The question was, there are so many religions on Earth. Have they been given to humanity?
What was the reason and what was the common in all these religions and beliefs for humanity? What was the purpose of it?
I don't know the purpose. I'm going to be honest. I don't think anyone knows the purpose. I'm not convinced. Yeah, if there is a purpose or not, I do know. I'm not going to pretend to know. Is there a common idea behind them? Difficult to say. I think part of it, potentially, at least for many of these traditions, maybe not all, is about how to live life. As much as you can talk about afterlife beliefs and things like that, I think in many respects, religious tradition is about how to live your life in the best way. Now, the focus of that can differ. You know, we're used to in sort of Western countries where Christianity has been the dominant framework for many centuries, to think of religion in reference to how to get into the afterlife, how to have a relationship with a transcendent deity. For most people throughout most of human history, the focus of religion has been far more pragmatic. It's been how to deal with the fact that there could be a famine, how to deal with the fact that your child is sick, how to deal with these sorts of things. Healing practices are often so interwoven with religious traditions in the majority of the world, in the majority of world history. And that actually goes for Christianity as well. If you think of medieval Catholicism, a huge focus was on how to heal yourself using the powers of the saints. You know, you go to Lourdes, you go to wherever it may be, seeking a cure for what ails you. So I think if there is one singular commonality to every religious tradition, it's an if. It's about how to live life in a way that gets you through it, that gets you to the end of the day, and on. I think it's quite pragmatic in that sense, but whether that's actually true or not. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I did have one. One of the things you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting is how paganism, obviously specific beliefs and names for things developed for their local areas and how they are. The reason I came here today actually was, thank you for the talk by the way, it's always good to learn, was that in my own life, I'm a very mixed background. I grew up around the world. I've got like Chinese, Northern Irish in me, Pakistani, Indian, it just in my blood, let alone where I grew up. So it's always been very confusing, but the one thing I learned as I travelled is that I always seem to find the way I look at the world falling in line with what people call pagan. But one thing I noticed, which is what you mentioned over there, is a common thread, was that a lot of these different religions that set up in different places all had very similar concepts. But I've never found myself drawn to one of them, because of how I grew up. And I don't know, from what you described, all of these pagan groups where they are very specific. Is that in their nature, or would
geographically specific, or
or do they need to be, or has it always been that way, or are they?
I think it's dependent on tradition by on modern pagan tradition by modern pagan tradition. As I mentioned, a lot of forms of early modern paganism were rooted in these kind of cultural nationalisms, often ethnic nationalisms. The idea that the worship of certain gods is in the blood. This was intrinsic, and there are still many pagan groups that do hold to those beliefs. Something like Wicca or the goddess movement have usually a very different attitude. They are not sort of proselytizing in the sense that Christianity is. They're not trying to convert everyone in the world, but they are much more open to spreading and sort of welcoming almost anyone. They're also then willing to draw much more on other religious traditions, and of course this is a criticism that's gone back a few decades but is gaining traction, is then the accusations of cultural appropriation when you have Wiccan groups or goddess movement groups that are drawing, for example, deities from various African societies, from India, from Japan, and sort of basically taking them out of their original cultural context and fitting them in a new theological framework.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are complex arguments about that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Final question.
You've been waiting so
Have you
long.
ever considered it to be transitional for like developmental path for a mind specifically? Like if you were to think every single human being as part of a general mind that transitions from step to step, could it be that, I don't know if you found in your findings, transition between one mind to another mind to way of seeing, kind of like as if you were stuck in cycles of existence, you could see yourself living a determinist philosophy, whereas when transition says something like nature, because you have suddenly developed a deep connection or passion to nature itself. So, you ever seen that sort of correlation?
If I understand you correctly, and it's possible I haven't, you're sort of talking about almost like pagan religions as a transition between different religious frameworks?
Yes.
Sort of moving from polytheism to monotheism to monism almost.
Yeah.
I mean, this was very much the framework of a lot of the 19th century. Sort of very Victorian idea of stages of cultural evolution. That is not exclusively 19th century, it has predecessors, but that's when, in an academic sense, it becomes the dominant framework. The work of people like James Fraser and Edward Tyler very much fit this in and try to understand societies in some stages that they can draw around and say, this isn't really an approach that's been, I suppose, accepted in academic thought for the better part of a century. Are you talking about it more in a spiritual sense, though, or rather than a cultural sense? In which case, I'm not qualified to comment.
Just curious, really.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not qualified to comment. It's probably
Worth discussing.